Yes, there's a new season of Formula One Drive to Survive out on Netflix. Ahead of the new actual season of Formula One that's coming out that I'm very excited for, and stirring up some questions that I think are always brought up when the new season of the show comes out, which is it's calling itself a docuseries, but is it lying about that? And I guess the more important question is Drive to Survive on Formula One a liar? I want to get into it. I want to first start by saying it does seem like the Netflix show is sort of geared a little bit more towards Americans than other shows could be, considering Formula One is a very European sport in its nature. I mean, it's a world sport, but it's a Europe. Like most of the thing takes place in Europe. The first episode of the new season, the first 5 minutes is all subtitles because it's in Italian, and maybe I'm just a loud, awful American, but even as somebody who will put up with subtitles, everybody speaks English, and yet we're going to have an entire storyline about two rich CEOs going off to a vineyard in Europe, and it's all in Italian, and so it's subtitles. Rough start, guys. Rough start. For what it's worth, I like Matteo Binotto. I was pretty sure he's gonna get the axe this year. I was pretty sure every year that he's gonna get the axe, but I like Matteo, and Gunther Steiner is a star, and I'll get into the Gunther Steiner of it all later. But to initially try to answer this, I'm going to use the chart, and the first, is F1 Drive to Survive a liar? I think the first answer is yes. I think it's an easy yes. I don't think that's the full answer to the question, but I think the reason it's an easy yes is Formula One fans. They see this, they watch the sport, they watch a bunch of stuff of the sport. Different types of fans watch different amounts of Formula One. I tend to watch a lot of it, but the way Drive to Survive presents itself, it's just factually wrong a lot. So is it a liar? Yes. Like based on that, is it lying about stuff that's happening? Is it just sometimes it's just truth of omission because they're not there? Yes, but it does seem like in really established moments where it's pretty well known in the Formula One community what's going on, Drive to Survive gets stuff wrong sometimes. So the first answer is yes, but I don't think that's the only answer. So let's keep going. I think this is especially true if it's calling itself a docuseries, and everywhere I looked, it refers to itself as a docuseries, which refers to documentary, which refers to documenting some kind of aspect of life, or I'll go into sort of the definition of a documentary because I think that's important, but because it's calling itself a docuseries, when it gets something wrong, I feel like it gets something really wrong, whereas if it's called a reality show, which is a different side of the storytelling world, maybe it can get away with stuff. And so that's kind of what I'm arguing, and I'll get into my chart about why, but I think maybe this could be more of a reality show than a docuseries just based on how they're doing it. I think it's worth acknowledging that this show is, by its nature, a unique and exclusive look at the F1 season and the drivers and the team bosses and all that kind of stuff that you don't normally see in F1. There's a bit of an asterisk there because depending on how you watch and where you watch, you will get almost all of this, and a lot of times you'll actually get more depending on what you're really interested in, but it is a different kind of watching it, and it does act like a documentary in that it's following these people around and it's getting certain things that you'd only get by following people around with cameras and microphones. I think that's worth acknowledging. And the last thing I want to put up to start us off is Toto Wolff did a quote, I think it was in either episode 1 or episode 2 of this new season, where they said something about, you want to be part of this documentary, and he said something to the effect of, documentary, this is more like you guys are making Top Gun. I think that's actually like a weirdly wise quote from the terrifying Toto Wolff, because he's right. When Netflix shows up to make this docu-series, it's a whole production. It's a Hollywood-style production. So it's not the same as, an independent filmmaker following people around with a camera with the expectation of turning that into a documentary. This is a whole thing. The train's already left the station. Stuff's going. I guess that's really what I'm say about that. I think the first thing that needs to get acknowledged about the show, especially because it's this big sprawling docuseries, is there's a level of messiness to it. I don't think that's a secret. I think part of that is unlike regular docuseries that are documenting something that it's not well known, because that's one of the natures of documentary, is trying to bring known something that's not well known. Especially in the Formula One community, Formula One is well known, and so there's factual errors, there's all kind of stuff. So let me just throw these up here. We got fabricated storylines. This show seems to be notorious for that. I'm not going to point to any specific ones. I think if you want to just be around Formula One, or if you want to watch Formula One YouTubers or go into the websites or anything, they are really good at pointing to when the storylines are fabricated, or when stuff is taken from one thing and put to another, which is my next card. Clips from different races or moments being put in for dramatic effect and completely undermining the continuity. This also leads to the fact that the show itself jumps around in time and place. Basically, every episode is sort of trying to tell a complete story, which, even if you ignore the fact that it's not trying to be a linear story and it does jump around, it gets confusing, redundant, and they're taking obvious crowd shots from one place sometimes and putting it into a different location. And is it sloppy? Is it deceitful? I don't know. I would argue, for the sake of storytelling, it's for the sake of, keeping the emotion high and keeping the storytelling accurate to the emotion of the moment, as instead of clinically accurate. But again, because we have Formula One as a thing that you can watch live, a thing that you can watch in a bunch of different ways, even if you don't inherently notice the mistakes, you can check the mistakes and you can find the mistakes wrong, which I think undermines the whole documentary about it. That's what repeats. In the same way your favorite Cartoon Network dubbed anime does previously on and next time on, and it's half the episode, this show does this too. I guess it's to try to sell us on the idea that we need to keep watching, but again, if you're going to watch some of this, I don't know why you wouldn't watch all of it. But yeah, the previously on, next time on, and the fact that it overlaps itself over and over again, that shows Monaco in a bunch of episodes, it shows the finale in a bunch of episodes, like all that kind of stuff. Is it really necessary to show previously on and next time on in that way? Honestly. There's also the obvious stuff that was missed. Part of that is, again, Formula One isn't there for however many races there were, 22 this year. That's probably not the right number, but part of that is they're not showing up for all of it. Part of it is they're trying to edit together some kind of semblance of a story. But again, as fans, as people that are watching this, as people who, again, this is season 5, which I think is also an overlooked thing, which I might talk towards in a minute, but stuff that gets missed, and it seems sloppy. So, and then I think this was in episode 3 of this season, but so you know how like the Wilhelm scream is in Star Wars and Star Trek? It's like everywhere. It's a very common sound effect. I recognize sound effects mostly from video games that I was growing up with, but there's like a Command and Conquer audience cheer sound, and they used it, I think season 5, episode 3, like 8 or 9 times over the course of like 15 minutes in the same scene in a couple times. And I was like, what? Why are we? Sure, canned audience sounds for the sake of the narrative. Sure, I don't hate that inherently, especially if it doesn't detract from the story. But when it's identically the same sound over and over again, it comes off as lazy. It comes off as lazy and comes off as messy, and how nobody caught that, or how nobody realized that was going to be so obnoxious. I mean, I'm open to the idea that maybe the audience made that same noise over and over again because it was the same venue, I think, for that entire episode, but it called attention to itself, so something was going on there. So before I move on, I think I just got to mention the fact that this show, Drive to Survive, it's on season 5. Each episode is labeled blah, 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 and it's sort of implied, but it's also sort of mentioned that each season is a reference to the previous season of Formula One racing. Makes sense inherently, but a show like this that is supposed to sort of show the behind the scenes, show the inner workings, really get a feel for the environment and the characters, all that kind of stuff. Why would you want to call it season 5 and not call it just something unique? Why would you not make a situation where any viewer, any fan can come in at season 5 and watch it and not have to worry about the previous seasons? That's sort of the fun of live sports to begin with, is you don't have to have been a fan in the last season to get on board and be a fan of the new season, especially with the way they tell the story of the show. I mean, Will Buxton, God bless him, every time he's on screen for this show, it drives me crazy because I know he's going to, Play-Doh level, try to explain, not Play-Doh, but Play-Doh, like the child's toy, try to explain something that I guess is useful if you've never come across Formula One. So I think I see the utility in it. But every time Will Buxton shows up, I know he's going to explain something in such a simplistic way that it almost seems inaccurate. If they're doing that in season 5, why call this season 5? Why not call this the 2022 race season? Why not say, hey, come on in. You don't need to watch seasons 1 through 4 to understand this. You can come on in whenever you want because you're going to fall in love with characters based on who they are in this moment. You don't need to know who Pierre Gasly was in season 1 compared to season 5. That's really not relevant. That's really not helpful for the point of the show. So I don't know why they keep doing this. I think it must be an oversight. But the idea that you're going to expect, like somebody from Netflix is going to expect a fan or a potential fan for Formula One to watch the first season and then the second season and then the third season and then the fourth season and now the fifth season to catch up. A true fan will do it, but for the sake of getting new fans, for the sake of getting people to actually watch the show, this seems like one of those situations where starting from the beginning seems like a waste of time. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking out of my ass here. Anyway, moving on. Another common complaint, or at least critique that I have of the show, it's unlike most documentaries, this isn't really a behind the curtain. And again, it's in reference to the fact that there's ways to watch Formula One. The way I do it the most is on YouTube. I watch a bunch of Formula One channels on YouTube. Some are Formula One branded, some are different brands. I feel some kind of way about those 2 hosts getting fired, or 3, I forget. But I watch a lot of Formula One content, especially on YouTube, but also on other stuff. This Netflix aspect of it is, it offers certain things that are additional to what I would experience for Formula One, but also I know I can find that kind of stuff out there basically in real time if I want to. So part of that is just watching the season itself because, again, as a docuseries, this stuff, it's going to be a sport that happens no matter what. This isn't like the training camp for a football team and you're watching who's going to get signed onto this. It's not that. It's not the Mark Wahlberg, the Philadelphia Eagles story. This is like an ongoing and evolving thing. And so the Netflix show needs to understand that it's an aspect of the conversation, but it's not the conversation, if that makes sense. So just watching the race season, I feel like just solves a lot of that depending on your level of involvement. If you're just getting into it, sure, there's a surface level way to appreciate it. If you're a diehard fan who watches all the technical briefs and that kind of thing and watches all the conference stuff and all the driver briefings and everything, that's a thing that happens too. I don't think the Netflix show necessarily caters to that quite as efficiently. And part of that is everyone has socials. Actually, I'm going to put that by the messiness because I think that actually works because as we've established, social media is as good at a bad thing as anything else. Again, Netflix is just going to be Netflix, so it's going to say, hey, watch the show. But we got to understand that the drivers, these are celebrities. These are some of the highest paid athletes in the world, and they have an entire brand. Also, they're press trained. And so not only do they have social media because they're all my age or younger at this point, we're getting a lot of Gen Z drivers all of a sudden, but they all have social media and they all have press training. And so you're not going to see the kind of sort of silliness and posturing that you're going to see in like prize fighting or organized fighting these days, because these drivers, since they were young children, have been understood to not only learn how to drive and keep fit and stay competitive, but they all know each other and they all know how to interact and they all know how to work in front of the press because they're press trained. Not a novel idea, but I thought it was worth mentioning. And so now I think it's worth asking, who is this made for and why is this show Drive to Survive? What about it is unique? Because I think that's really what's different, because you can get most of this stuff anywhere. It's just like in education. You can get it at a community college, you can get it at a high school, you can get it at a Ivy League university. There's different ways to get kind of the same thing. You can get that with Formula One too. So let's ask, is this made for the Formula One fans? I don't know. As a fan who watches a bit of everything, sure, I'll watch this, but I gotta say, this season especially, it was a little bit more grating, and I really don't get the sort of the adrenaline rush and the excitement of the race weekend in a meaningful way that I do when I'm actually watching the race weekend, and maybe that's just how I understand it, and maybe that's not everybody's experience, but yes, there is sort of like there's a weird artifice that the show has that regular Formula One doesn't necessarily have, because it does seem like they're trying to talk to a different person, not just the fan. Americans. Is it for Americans? I don't think it's much of a secret. The show is a huge hit, and a lot of that is the fact that it's kind of an American show. I don't think that's much of a secret. It also helps that American audiences are actually starting to embrace Formula One finally, which is a surprise to me. And so not only are American audiences showing up, but actually there's more American tracks opening up in the Formula One circuit. I think that's great. I think it's going to make it a little bit more of an obnoxious of a show because of a race, because Americans. I'm an American. We're obnoxious, so it's going to be good, but it's going to be bad. It is what it is. And so, is this show made for Americans? Is this sort of like a baby's first race to try to get you into Americans into the show, into the race? Possibly. The way Will Buxton describes it, I think there's a strong argument there for sure. Is this made for reality show fans? And that's really what I'm angling towards here, because again, this is purporting itself as a documentary series, a docuseries, but it plays out more like a reality show, especially because each episode is focused on one specific thing. You can argue that, good docuseries have this ability sometimes to focus on one aspect of a story, sort of the Rashomon approach, one point of view today, one point of view for the next episode, one point of view for a different episode. But this one it's messy, it splits the difference, so it's a little bit of everything. I think it'd be a mistake to try to market Drive to Survive to reality show fans, because the same people that are watching the Kardashians are not necessarily the same people that are going to be watching Drive to Survive. Again, I'm sure there's overlap, but I think it's undeniable that reality shows like the Kardashians, like those kind of shows, again, they're not for me, but there's a massive, audience that will consume that stuff. I just don't see that kind of psychology working with Drive to Survive, even though I think some of the most interesting stuff that Drive to Survive offers is the same stuff that makes the Kardashian shows so easily digestible, which is the character interactions, the silliness, the Gunther Steiner of it all, the bombastic, obnoxious stuff that is shocking for shocking's sake. I think that actually works for the show. That's reality show stuff. It really is. So what does Drive to Survive do that is unique compared to any other version of getting into Formula One? I think the big thing is because there's cameras on the ground, there's people with microphones, you get candid moments. I say candid because, again, these people are all press trained and they really do understand how to talk and when to talk. And, especially early on, kind of less seasons later now, which I guess is the point, but especially early on, a lot of the teams and a lot of the team bosses, a lot of the drivers didn't even want to interact with the Netflix series. Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Toto Wolff famously wanted nothing to do with, wouldn't sit down for an interview, would just have total malice for when they saw him on the track. And it was because it was an added pressure, because again, these people are pros. Their job is to go fast and not make mistakes. And if you're putting a camera in somebody's face, that's when mistakes happen. That's when it's an added variable that I think a lot of the drivers and a lot of the team bosses would argue it's an unnecessary variable to something that's already incredibly difficult. And so that seems to have faded a little bit. In season 5, Toto sat down for an interview. Lewis sat down for interviews. So, I don't know. I think mentalities are changing. Maybe they got talked to. Maybe they got offered money. I think it was probably they got talked to, if I'm going to be honest. But yeah, so candid moments, but also, not. I think it's worth acknowledging that, some drivers are actually very ready, camera ready. The camera loves them. I think obviously Daniel Ricciardo, even before Drive to Survive was out, was that guy, was the smiling face of Formula One. That was the TV face. Gunther Steiner, now the Drive to Survive is out, is sort of a breakout hit character because he's so obnoxious. The him standing in the fake boat thing was absolutely gold. He's a cartoon character. He lives a crazy life. I feel like they tried to triple down on that on this new season. I don't know. I think we're getting a little stale on Gunther Steiner just because he's the same note. Yeah, I'm trying to think who else would be. Pierre Gasly, I think, is a good standout. He's very polite. And then there's also George Russell and Lando Norris. These guys are young. They're press trained. They understand, the TV, the making a movie aspect of it. and it works for them. And they get storylines, and it seems to only help their brand because they're likable, charming young men. I do think Drive to Survive, to their credit, sometimes explains difficult things like, race politics and controversies. They do a good job doing it well. Again, I will say it's usually Will Buxton, the one explaining it, which annoys me, but that seems to be his role in the story. So I don't begrudge it, but I just find it like viscerally kind of an annoying thing. And then the Netflix of it all. What makes Drive to Survive unique? It's Netflix, which means it's accessible to anybody that has Netflix, but more importantly, it has Netflix production values, which means it looks like a movie. Is that different from what actually Formula One's visual quality is normally? Not as much as you'd think. I feel like Netflix put the camera in some interesting spots because it seems like they have a deal with Formula One where they can only get their material. This also shows up when they're sort of stealing pull quotes and stealing stuff from obviously a Formula One reporter, but they're not allowed to show her face because that would have been a violation, but somehow they're able to show her voice. I don't really understand the rules and the politics of that all. Maybe it's a country by country thing. I don't really understand it, but yes, a Netflix show, there's a reasonable expectation that it's a high quality in how it looks and how it's presented. I think that's delivered here. But again, Formula One being one of the most expensive, visually stunning, like spectator sports that exists, already kind of has that going for it. It's a different aesthetic from the Netflix Drive to Survive aesthetic, but it's not that different. I don't think I would confuse the two in the way something like Top Gear or the Grand Tour. I would not confuse those with Formula One, and I wouldn't confuse those with the Netflix show. So just saying. So now let's talk about the docuseries versus reality series argument that I'm trying to make here, because again, if my argument is Drive to Survive a liar? I don't know, but I think they're just miscategorizing themselves. So I want to talk about the difference between a documentary and a reality. Broad strokes here, and a lot of this is just Googling, but I think the spirit is more important. So docuseries, document reality. Documentaries document reality. They're also known for instruction or education or historical record. They're also, again, this is Wikipedia pull quotes here. This is the creative treatment of actuality, or life as it is, or life caught unawares. These are, really famous quotes. Again, I'm pulling off of Wikipedia because I was lazy, but I think the point is there's a very specific kind of point of view that documentary is. Obviously, documentary is an amorphous thing, just like any other sort of TV or film thing, but I think this is a good framework to work off of. And then some hallmarks. We have interviews versus, I feel like reality usually has more confessionals, but it's the same thing. It's people sitting in a chair or standing in front of something, doing it to camera, kind of the way I'm doing it now, except they're explaining something. And then I think one of the big hallmarks of documentaries is their accuracy. I think the big criticism about documentaries in a negative way is they're not accurate, whereas you come to a Ken Burns documentary, for instance, the whole thing, it has its visual aesthetic, which is interesting, but it's the accuracy and the authority of how they're telling the story that I think is so useful as a documentary. So let's talk about reality. So first thing is, purports to be unscripted real life situations. I think it's been very obviously proven at this point there's some sort of scripting involved in reality. I think that's why this show may actually be a reality show and not a documentary series, because it seems like they're writing storylines. It seems like they're trying to build something. There's the idea of a documentary, you go out from in, you take material and you try to form a narrative out of that. I think the level of the extreme level that they're doing here actually does point to a reality show more than a docuseries. We also have confessionals in place of interviews. Again, they're pretty interchangeable, but they are a little bit different. It's an authoritative thing. I think Will Buxton explaining something in the show is from an authoritative thing. I think the rest of the interviews, they're more for entertainment value. And that's really the last one is, whereas documentaries usually try to focus on the accuracy or validity of what they're doing or their argument or the story they're trying to tell. And so I think the whole documentary versus reality series is kind of what I'm getting at, because it is both. It is purporting itself to be a documentary series in that it's showing the real of what's happening. It's showing candid moments. It's showing, real interactions, but it's also doing reality stuff where it's taking stuff like crowds from the wrong race. It's taking moments from a different time. It's manipulating time. It's manipulating space for the sake of the storytelling, for the sake of the emotion. And if you're a diehard fan who knows what the Abu Dhabi crowd looks like versus the Silverstone crowd, that's going to be grating when they make a mistake. But if you're a fan who's just watching it for the sake of the storytelling, it might not be that big of a deal. So I do think it's both, but I do think because it's doing this manipulation, because it's doing these either factual errors or more likely just trying to cut stuff together that tracks the emotion correctly, I think that means reality show. I think that means an unscripted show and not a documentary in the way that in a documentary is about accuracy and precision and authority, again, pointing to education, instruction, historical record. It seems much more for entertainment value. And so the last thing is whether or not you like the show, whether or not you think the show is accurate, whether or not you think the show is willfully manipulating storylines. I think it's great for the sport. I really do. It's Netflix, and so people can watch it based on having Netflix, but specifically Americans, considering there's going to be more and more American tracks and there's more American fans every year, and the show obviously is a hit. I do think it's great for the sport. I consider it more an add-on to the glorious cornucopia that is all the media around the sport to begin with. I don't think it replaces anything. I do think there's certain elements of it that add to the sport that I wouldn't have got otherwise. I would not really have understood Gunther Steiner's personality had I not watched Drive to Survive. But short of that, Daniel Ricciardo is always going to be Daniel Ricciardo. That was never a mystery to me. And most of what goes on behind the scenes is either inferred or I see it in other places anyway. I think it's going to be part of the conversation. I think that's where it stands. Is it's important to be part of the conversation, but it's not the whole conversation. I think it would like to be. I'm kind of getting the vibe that it thinks it should be the whole conversation, which it definitely shouldn't and can't and won't. I think it's acknowledging the kind of fan that would watch this kind of show, because if you're a diehard Formula One fan that watches everything, you might find this a little bit hard to digest because there's just some inaccuracies and some falsehoods about it. But overall, it's a very interesting experience of watching the characters in this universe. But it's not the only thing. I think the more common kind of fan is the person getting into, they're trying to get maybe a crash course or trying to get their way into a new sport, trying to fall in love with a new sport. Again, I think that's a little irresponsible for them to call it season 5 when they should have just called it the 2022 race season, which could indicate that you can start at 2022. You don't have to go all the way back to 2018 or 2019 when they started the show, because that's a pretty daunting ask to have them watch the whole show when they really just want to catch up with the current drivers and the current race situation, which I think is perfectly fine. And that's the way sports has worked the whole time. I have no complaints. And then there's the idea of the show as part of Formula One and the greater motorsport universe. I think it can only help. I think bringing awareness or being able to tell these stories to a new, different audience, I think is perfectly fine. I don't necessarily think the fact that this is the rich man's sport and the white man's sport, and we're watching CEOs go off to their vacation homes during the summer break, I don't necessarily think that's, socially a helpful documentary type thing to do, but it's a kind of story, it's a kind of world, and you're getting an introduction into it through this show, and I think there's some use to that. I think the more useful thing is to getting people interested and passionate about Formula One specifically and the idea of motorsport as an idea, bringing those people in and having them become fans of motorsport where they otherwise wouldn't be. I think that's where it's useful. I do have a couple final notes. I think the show is a little bit unrefined, a little bit messy, as I talked about earlier, with messing with storylines and messing with stuff, but also just you're used to a fit and finish that Netflix is supposed to be very high, and this show sometimes gets there, and I feel like sometimes this show, it feels like it could be on just a regular broadcast channel, which is implied to be a lower quality, so not ideal. And the other thing is I think it's really obvious that the show cannot show non-Netflix stuff. This is pulling quotes and pulling, dialogue from stuff that they didn't film, but it's also the fact that they're only showing certain races because they were only able to go to certain races. I believe this year they were able to go to more and they got more interviews. Again, I mentioned Max and Lewis and Toto actually agreed to do interviews this time, but there's a really obvious void and sort of missing the greater picture. And so if the plan for the show was to tell the greater picture of the season, I think they're cutting themselves down just by the fact that they didn't attend every season. I know that would be cost preventative and logistically difficult, but if they're trying to tell a complete story, they need to be able to tell a complete story. I think if they're just going to tell these little individual stories that overlap but make it a little bit more chaotic, I think that's a way to do it. I just don't think that's the most efficient way to do it. And again, that's why I point to it being a reality show versus a docuseries, because they're trying to manufacture a storyline with what they have versus presenting the information for what it is. But that's what I got. What do you guys think? Is this a complete waste of time? Do you like the pretty colors? I'm a huge fan of Formula One. I'm a recent add-on. You know, I think I started watching Formula One a couple years before Drive to Survive came out. And I have a love-hate relationship with the show because I like a lot of it, but then when stuff takes me out of it, it really takes me out of it. And I only really get the adrenaline rush and the big, you know, emotional moments when I'm watching the actual footage of the racing. Drive to Survive, for some reason, doesn't do it for me. I don't know why. The music is good. The sound score is good. Maybe I just have a broken brain. So like, share, subscribe. What do you guys think? I'll catch you next time.